Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the audience, both here in the room in Brussels and those following online. We're here today for what I'm sure will be a very fascinating discussion about a new special report out this morning by the Committee to Protect Journalists. It's called Fragile Progress, the Struggle for Press Freedom in the European Union. For those in the room, you have print copies at the door. And for those following online, I put the link in the chat and it's available on the CPJ website. Before I turn it over to our speakers, just some logistics. After the presentation of the report, we'll take questions both from the room and online. So for those in the room, we'll have a mic. And for those following online, you can put your questions at any point in the chat, and then during the Q&A, I'll get to them. Please make sure that your questions address the report and our speakers. If you have a question to a specific speaker, please note that as well. I'm Lili Bayer, a reporter at Politico, and our panelists today are the co-authors of the Fragile Progress report. So we have Jean-Paul Marthoz, a columnist at Le Soir and the author of many books. And we also have Tom Gibson, the Committee to Protect Journalists EU representative here in Brussels. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lili, and thanks for everyone who can make it, who's made it today. Just to begin with a few words about the Committee to Protect Journalists. We're an international press freedom organization. We defend the right of journalists to report the news safely and without fear of reprisal. And in order to do this, we research and report on press freedom violations. We advocate for remedy and change. And we also provide emergency support and assistance to journalists at risk. What are we trying to do with this report? This report is a snapshot of where the EU institutions currently are on press freedom. The report notes the progress that we've seen in recent years. This is commendable, but it also finds a gap between the democratic values of the EU and the reality of how it and its member states can pursue their interests. We have a diverse range of recommendations to the various institutions, and we hope that this can develop into a discussion around strengthening the EU's role as a defender of press freedom. In short, our recommendations call on the EU to ensure that the ongoing press freedom reforms are robust and that they become robust enough to become effective tools in the defense of press freedom. The EU must remedy problematic EU legislation, policy or practice that restricts the work of journalists. And the EU must continue to strengthen its range of political, diplomatic and emergency assistance to journalists in third countries. And lastly, we're calling for commitments for next year's elections. So this report brings together a number of press freedom issues, and we've done this in a medium-sized report. And hopefully the report is presented in a way that people outside of the Brussels bubble or outside of the European press freedom circles will be able to better engage with the issues and see the importance of the issues. But this report actually also follows a research legacy for CPJ.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Tom, for already spelling out the objectives of this report. In fact, this is the second report on the European Union and press freedom. In 2015, I was asked by CPJ at the time to write a first report on the EU, as CPJ wanted to make sure that an institution like the EU, which has a big presence abroad, could be enlisted together with other countries to defend press freedom. And so the idea was to analyze first the press freedom diplomacy of the EU. But in 2014, just a year before the launch of the report, we went to Hungary for a mission, and we discovered with awe that in an EU member states, some of the big issues that we tended to denounce outside of the European Union or outside of democratic countries were suddenly happening inside the European Union. The report we published at the time was titled "Creeping Authoritarianism in Hungary." And so after that, that mission, the purpose was also to integrate the discussion on the state of press freedom within the European Union, and not just about its press freedom diplomacy outside of its borders, which has been well documented for many, many years. I remember as an old journalist that in 1980s already, the French Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Claude Cheysson, was supporting, for instance, media, free media, independent media in South Africa and Chile under authoritarian regime. So there's been a tradition, but to analyze the situation in a member state was really something quite new. And we could see trends that are today still there. Trends over populism, nationalism, the will to capture the media, discrimination against independent journalism, a number of issues which were not supposed to be part of the philosophy and the practices of EU member states. But the Hungarian case showed that once inside of the EU, you were to some extent free to backtrack on the commitments you took when you signed on the Copenhagen criteria for membership of the EU. And through our discussion with actors of the media issue in Brussels, officials, members of NGOs, working on a number of different issues linked to freedom of the press, we discovered, of course, that the EU was very ill-equipped to deal with those kind of challenges. First, because it didn't have really the legal mechanism in place to counter those kinds of developments within its member states. Some member states were aware of the dangers, perhaps, of giving too much power, even for a good cause, to the European institutions in Brussels. And some political groups, for their own partisan objectives, were ready to tolerate in their ranks a political party which was at the time still today prevailing in Hungary. So all those issues led to a discussion on how the EU could develop a number of mechanisms, procedures to make sure that member states would respect their commitments under the treaties and under the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And by working on this issue, we discovered that the EU, which pretended not to have so much power in terms of the media, because people always said at the time, the media are policies that are reserved for member states or for institutions like the Council of Europe or the European Court of Human Rights. But in fact, already in the 2010s or 2015s, the EU was developing a number of policies which had an impact on the way journalists had to work, on the way freedom of expression developed in Europe. And so it built into this report, which is the old one, which sort of is not the reference, but it's a reference for us to assess the progress. And the title of the new report is called Fragile Progress, because it's sort of measured against what was stated in the first report. And so I would like to just finish my first intervention by a quote from Portuguese MEP Rui Tavares at the time that I interviewed. And he said, and I think this is a real question, I will see whether there's an answer to his question. He said, "I would like the European Union to be as imaginative on fundamental rights as it has been on austerity programs." So, Tom.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. And we do see, again, this fragile progress. And I think it's good for me now to follow on chronologically a little bit from what Jean-Paul has said, and to take us perhaps forward to about 2017 and 2018. In particular, the murders of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta in 2017, and Jan Kuciak in Slovakia in 2018. Why is this important? I think it's important because it really shook the narrative, the press freedom narrative here in Brussels. Both journalists investigated corruption, they looked at financial crime or wrongdoing that actually affected the EU institutions. And both murders also underscored how Europe can no longer be considered a safe place for journalists. And the European Parliament and the European Commission, that their response to the murders was really important here. Both bodies became very active. We had lots of hearings, meetings, resolutions. We had country visits where officials went to the countries and talked to the families, but they also looked at the press freedom environment and looked at the conditions that journalists were working in. And there was this real sense of mobilization that brought us up to the 2019 European elections. And there was a sense that something had to change. As Jean-Paul said, there had been this threat from illiberal democracies, and this threat was undermining EU values. And in addition, Brussels could see that press freedom was under attack. Journalists had been murdered and they had to do something. So part of this sort of moment, this pivotal moment, was the appointment of a vice president of the Commission, Vera Jourova, the Commissioner for Values and Transparency, because she was given a specific mandate to act on press freedom. And this was very important. It was a political commitment to media freedom and pluralism from the Commission. And it also recognized that the Commission saw that journalists played an important role in defending EU values, which then led us to the European Democracy Action Plan. I'm going to talk about the EU reforms here, but the European Democracy Action Plan was, in essence, if we're going to simplify, to sort of a 5-year checklist for the European Commission, what needs to be done. There are a range of different reforms. Some of the ones that press freedom advocates are currently working on, the European Media Freedom Act, which is currently being negotiated, provides this sort of transparency and accountability on issues relating to media capture. And I guess part of the push here is, as Jean-Paul has mentioned, this move by liberal democracies to take control of the media landscape, as we have seen in the notable examples being Hungary and Poland. And in the report, we welcome the European Media Freedom Act. It uses internal market law as its basis. This is also its basis, but it also provides for its limitations. And we see that it could contribute positively to media pluralism and independence, but we want it to be as ambitious as possible. We want stronger provisions in there regarding things like protecting journalists from surveillance and guaranteeing real media ownership transparency. There's also the role of the European Board for Media Services, created of national regulatory bodies. We want this to become important, independent, an oversight body with good relations with the press freedom community. But what we need is member state support here. The pending anti-SLAPP directive, in addition, has been put forward by the Commission. This has the intention of stopping abusive lawsuits that intend to silence journalists. They're started by the rich and powerful, and the aim is to stop critical journalism. The report also notes that the anti-SLAPP directive is also under pressure from member states and also publishers. And we are concerned that there's a draft compromise from the Council, a recent compromise that waters down the text, including the provisions for cross-border cases, which it covers, but also the threshold for which SLAPP cases could be considered, meaning in practice it would actually it would help less journalists. And again, we need to, at this important moment, and this is what we're trying to do with the report, we need to renew that message for political support. The real aim is to protect individuals who are subject to these vexatious lawsuits. This has to be a priority for the Council. A couple of other important things. The journalist safety recommendation provides a template for member state action. It is a recommendation, so it's non-binding, but it does look at some of these conditions that journalists around Europe are facing, the physical threats, unresponsive law enforcement, online harassment. And it also has an emphasis on female and minority journalists. But again, you know, and this is a reoccurring message, what it now comes down to is political will, good political will from the member states to really put in place positive measures. And we want to see good examples of practice and we want to promote them, but we're not there yet. A way of doing that, of course, would be another big thing for not just the press freedom community, but for civil society more broadly, is the Rule of Law report, which is the EU's annual assessment of it includes media freedom as one of the 4 pillars. We want this report to be a tool that really works. There are 2 things. It has to demonstrate that it can secure change, and it has to be used and trusted by the journalist community around Europe. This is very important. And I would like to direct you to the recommendation section of the report, where we actually call for better coordination and transparency from the Commission. And we also want, they've started in last year's report to include recommendations. These need to be really precise so that I can very clearly see in any EU country what the precise are in terms of actual change, what needs to be done on the ground to make journalists safer and to improve media freedom. There's also the question of making, more broadly on the rule of law, making EU funds conditional on member states upholding press freedom as an EU value. We see this as real leverage. So these reforms are really positive. Brussels has come such a long way since I started in CPJ in 2017, but the question is how they're going to be applied and what's going to happen after the mandate of this current Commission. So outside of these reforms, we also have problematic draft legislation, which could have well-intentioned objectives, but could restrict the work of journalists once made into law. The child sexual abuse regulation introduces automated scanning of everyone's private communications and therefore threatens encryption. Now, obviously, encrypted messages and encryption are essential for journalists to be able to obtain confidential information and to protect their sources. In addition, the draft evidence regulation could help prosecutors access data held by internet service providers in another EU member state. Journalist data in one country could be compromised by a foreign government through the internet service provider. And the draft doesn't include all the necessary judicial oversight or safeguards that will fully protect journalists. And then there's active legislation, which additionally causes problems. GDPR, which was meant to safeguard data protection and privacy, and does also include the journalist exemption, is being misused, including by governments, to block publication or deny access to access requests for information. So this misuse of the GDPR is impacting journalists around EU member states. And one of the recommendations is that the Commission could consider, for example, formal infringement procedures against member states who misuse the GDPR to violate press freedom.
Just to continue along the words that Tom had just said concerning one of the issues that we have to confront as we take the position, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the name says it all, we take the position of journalists. How do measures, policies adopted by the European Union here and also abroad, I mean, measures that concern our colleagues are far away from our shores. I mean, how do they affect the exercise of independent and free journalism? This is the core mission of CPJ. This is the core, the angle that we took in most of those in the report. So Tom mentioned, for instance, the impact of the GDPR legislation, which has led a couple of media to have to respond to judicial measures to sort of sometimes change the way they cover an issue because GDPR is used to defend privacy, and many people would say that's fine, but at the same time, the use of GDPR can be instrumentalized in order to prevent some media to cover sensitive issues concerning specific individuals. So we have cases that are documented in the report showing that it can have unintended consequences and negative consequences with exercise of journalism. There are a number of other measures or policies taken by the European Union which may affect negatively the exercise of journalism. Although quite often journalist organizations have been able to extract kind of commitment on the part of the EU to defend journalist exemption, saying that journalists are not covered by this specific directive, for instance, because they have public interest, they have work in public interest, and they should be exempted from these provisions. So let's take, for instance, the question of the Trade Secrets Directive. I remember for years, journalists had been claiming that there was a risk in this directive that corporations and other organizations would use the very imprecise definition of what a trade secret is in order to some extent apply pressure, very similar to what the SLAPs are doing, the SLAP, the strategic lawsuits against public participations, so to intimidate journalists by sort of reacting very quickly and telling journalists shouldn't cover that because this is a trade secret and we are protected by a trade secret directive. Journalists had been for years calling for clarification and for a clear application of the journalist exemption. But it's many countries in Europe, I mean, this trade secret directive is being used quite systematically by some companies to prevent journalists from covering their, sometimes mistakes, errors, their failings, and sometimes their corruption. So we have a number of cases in France, for instance, where fortunately, in a couple of those cases, the judiciary at the end of the day supported the journalist exemption, but it creates an atmosphere, an environment in which many journalists, many investigative journalists, but not only investigative journalists, just common journalists covering issues in business and on corruption, on healthcare, whatever, they feel that there is a risk because of this trade secret directive, the way it had been transposed into national legislation and the way the judiciary applies it can be an obstacle to independent journalism in the public interest. So this is one case. It's being again documented by a few examples in the report. Take disinformation. Everyone agrees that disinformation is a problem for journalism, for the exercise of free journalism, because it really pollutes the flow of information. It creates channels for harassments against the press and against sources of the press. So it's really an issue that journalists know is part of the threats against media freedom. At the same time, we have to make sure that the measures you take to combat disinformation don't cross into censorship. And this is a balancing act, which is not always easy to have, to manage. And in a number of cases, I mean, journalist organizations have been concerned or have been critical sometimes also of some of the measures taken by the European Commission or announced by the European Commission. Issues, for instance, like linking the funding of media projects to the respect of some criteria, for instance, some norms, something which doesn't convince all journalist organizations, and there's a danger that there is too much power in the hands of the Commission to decide how those funds would be allocated, for instance. So those questions were also raised by the discussion about the suspension of RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik in Europe after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Those are discussions that are even dividing the press freedom community, but they are real discussions because they really put the big question front and center for the European Union. What is the concept of press freedom? What does it mean? Who is handling those sticky issues? What's the role of, how do the European Union really consult with journalist organizations to make sure that every step it takes will protect and not hamper journalism? There are a number of other issues that are mentioned in the report, which shows that the EU still has a lot of progress to make in questions, for instance, on transparency. Judging the level of transparency of the European Union depends very much about where you come from. If you come from a country which is authoritarian, where everything is closed, I mean, you would consider, and many journalists told me they would consider the way the EU is managing transparency as great, in the sense that you have tons of information in Brussels. Even people say so much information that it's used to clutter and to manipulate the media, because there's so much that you can't really handle the information that you get every day. But it's a journalistic challenge here, not really a press freedom challenge. But at the same time, when it comes to getting access to documents, and really the right to know information is a key criteria in any democracy, the right of citizen, not just of journalists, but of citizen, to get access to documents that are in the public interest. And comparing with what I wrote 8 years ago and today, there has not been that much progress, really. It's still very difficult on many subjects to have access to the documents that are really necessary for political actors, but also for citizens and journalists to understand how the EU is working. I list a number of examples, not going to list all the examples. We list examples in the document, but let's take only, for instance, the case of Ursula von der Leyen's email messages to the chair of Pfizer during the COVID crisis. I mean, it's a real debate. I mean, many people would consider, and we consider, but also the Ombudsman of the European Union consider, that access to those emails would be imperative, because they really represent a key moment in the discussion in negotiations of crucial policies of public interest. But you know that on this, the Commission has not budged. I mean, has really not moved. And this is one example, very topical. But there are other examples in the report where we mention the difficulty that many have to get access to trade negotiations, for instance, documents, to human rights dialogues, documents, for instance, which, of course, I mean, the reflex of any organization is to consider in a very strict way what they do as secret or confidential or pertaining to their own sphere. But we are in a democracy. In a democracy, the challenge is really to open up as far as we can the gates to get access to those documents, those discussions that are part of the democratic discussion, without which any democratic discussion cannot really take place. And it has been criticized. I mean, the transparency policy of the European Union of the European Commission has been criticized by the European Parliament, but even the European Parliament itself can be very bad in releasing some documents when it certainly concerns its own MEP. So this is a key challenge. There is a balancing act that we understand as journalists, as advocates for press freedom, but at the same time, there has not even been a fragile progress, I would say, if I may say, between 2015 and today on transparency. There's a lot that can be done without endangering the core and vital interest of the European Union as an actor, as a powerful actor inside and outside of its borders.
Another aspect that the report covers is that of the EU's protection of press freedom around the world. There are a number of very important instruments, frameworks, mechanisms that currently exist. And the External Action Service prioritizes the protection of journalists. It's one of the things that's covered in the Human Rights Action Plan. There's a huge amount of possible emergency funding Also more broadly, both for journalists in Europe and around the world, there's also access to funding for journalists. But what we do notice is that the ability or the capacity of the European Union to stand up to autocrats around the world on matters of press freedom, we find that this varies quite significantly. And we find that often human rights dialogues can be quite couched in diplomacy, that we don't necessarily get concrete answers on individual cases that we raise. At the same time, I would say that the European External Action Service is actually quite a mixed bag. I would say that some diplomats on the ground can really be a lifeline for journalists. So we have a real range from diplomats that are almost heroes in the eyes of journalists who need their help, to delegations just not responding. There's the assistance is non-existent. And we call for a number of things to be improved. One of them is the operationalization of the EU guidelines on freedom of expression online and offline. It's a lesser known document, but it's like a checklist of what diplomats can do. We also call for a reinforcement of GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, which has reduced trade tariffs for protecting human rights. This is currently being revised. We want this to be something that really gives the EU local leverage. And we also want journalists locally to be able to understand and be able to engage with the process. Part of this is the sort of outward facing approach that the External Action Service has with journalists on the ground. So the long-term test is really going to be how all of these actions trickle down to journalists on the ground, and also around the world. And we hope that the recommendations that we have in the report can serve as a discussion for what needs to happen. Within the EU institutions, this acknowledgement that, at least in Europe, protecting journalists, within the EU, protecting journalists is a pan-European problem. This is very important. It's cross-border. So having good journalism affects all our access to information, and we need to protect it. More sustained support is needed. In its foreign relations, the External Action Service can also demonstrate international leadership to continuing to strengthen its political and diplomatic assistance it provides, and actively fight against these inconsistencies and double standards that I spoke about. And at the very end of the report, we focus on elections. We've got elections around the corner. Let's make sure that the Commission has a strong mandate, and let's try to push for an ambitious vision of what the EU can do to keep journalists safe and defend media freedom.
I just add something. When we talk about the international relations and the press freedom diplomacy of the European Union, we have to be fair in the sense that when it comes to defending press freedom or freedom of expression more generally, in international fora, the European Union and its member states are usually on the good side of the debate. This is something we have to recognize in the UN and UNESCO, whatever. At the same time, there is another angle that's important to highlight, and CPJ is an international organization, it's a global organization. And I remembered the famous quote of Lee Bollinger, who is the president of Columbia University, a very close friend of CPJ. We said, censorship anywhere is censorship everywhere, meaning that what the EU is doing today has an impact globally. And there is even people mentioning the Brussels effect, in the sense that you have a number of measures or policies adopted by the European Union, which have an impact, globally beyond the borders of the European Union. And on some issues, some people congratulate the EU to set high standards on a number of issues. Others will be critical, saying that the European Union philosophy is perhaps a bit below the standards that other countries would consider free speech, even in the tradition of the First Amendment in the US. So there's a debate on this, but it is important to consider that everything that's being done in Brussels has a global impact. And just to reinforce what Tom has just said about the questions of double standards in the press freedom diplomacy, there's sort of a measurement that's quite interesting to mention, how to assess the reality of the commitment of the European Union in favor of press freedom outside of its borders. This is a quote by Ana Gomes, who was a former Portuguese foreign minister, a former MEP in Brussels. She said, the real nature of human rights diplomacy can be judged on the determination to confront countries that have a real importance to the EU. And I think this is a criteria which we always use when we try to assess the reality of the European Union commitment to freedom of the press abroad. You can see what happens to smaller countries with no real strategic or economic value for the EU. I mean, they tend to be the ones getting the slaps. Whereas if you have an oil-producing country which violates seriously human rights and press freedom, the temptation for the EU. As for other countries, the EU is not an exception here. It's a tragedy, the fate of democratic foreign policy with its sort of a principled pragmatism, but sometimes more pragmatic than principle, that you have this distortion between what the EU considers to be its silver thread of its foreign policy, which is the protection of human rights, and the reality on the ground.
Oh, thank you very much. As you can hear from the presentation, or for those of you who have the report in front of you, it covers a vast amount of themes. And I think that's very reflective of the time that we live in, when media freedom, unlike a few years ago, seems to be very much at the forefront of discussion here in Brussels, both on the legislative side and more broadly. But before we open it up for questions, I had a few of my own. The first is, you mentioned briefly elections and the new commission. What would you say should be the top priorities for the new commission when it comes to the issue of the press?
I mean, I think a continuation of the legacy of this commission. There are lots of different reforms that are in place, but what we want to see is that those reforms are implemented, and that they're implemented well. I mean, I do think that there's a very important verification mechanism, which is the rule of law reports. I think that this is really critical, because essentially, if the rule of law reports are going to be effective, they can really scrutinize what's happening within member states, and also be used by EU citizens, by journalists, to understand what demands can I make to my government in order for my government to improve the situation for journalists in this country. Now, the rule of law report, it's quite staggering how when I joined CPJ in 2017, this question of the rule of law report, it was almost like a fantasy. It was almost like a dream. And now it's a reality. But, you know, the process leads to very long reports. The website is very difficult to navigate. The recommendations are very imprecise, giving governments a huge amount of wiggle room. And, you know, the big question is whether or not it's used. So I think actually, you know, I wouldn't prioritize one reform over another, but I would say that the rule of law report should be used as a vehicle in order to really, you know, what do we want member states to do? What are the precise demands that we can make to them?
Yeah, I've definitely had the experience of printing out all of the Commission's rule of law reports in the newsroom and trying to go through them for the news lines. It's challenging. Yeah, yes.
I mean, we are in a specific moment. Of course, we have the election, but at the same time, we are in the middle of a situation of war in Europe. And there is really a priority for the European Union to make sure they have their standards very clear when it comes to defending press freedom. And so there might be a temptation in moments of crisis of considering press freedom as something which is not a priority because we have to focus on security issues. But I think there's the moment precisely when the European Union has to make sure that its defense of press freedom and more globally of human rights is on the set. It's not something which will hamper our reaction to aggression in Ukraine. On the contrary, the fact that the European Union can be sort of coherent in the way, consistent in the way it's going to defend the values on which it claims to be founded is the key to winning the war, the strategy of influence, if I may say, and the battle of influences that's taking part today in Europe. And in the battle against disinformation, which is state-organized disinformation as well. I mean, we have to consider media freedom really as an asset. Because at some point, sometimes I was a couple of days ago in a big conference with big intellectuals, and sometimes I feared that they were saying, you know, we are in a crisis. We have to consider our option, and our options are, you know, basically to strengthen our capacity. It's like during the anti-terror, the first years of anti-terrorism, where the consideration of protecting human rights and press freedom was often considered to be a liability in a fight against terrorism. Although today, most counterterrorism experts will say that defending the rule of law, defending human rights and defending press freedom are key ingredients to win the war in terrorism. It's the same for the war in Ukraine. So it is something which will be part, I suppose, of the election in 2024, because this question is already part of discussion in the national parliaments and the European Parliament. And there are parties, groups, individuals in those parliaments that disagree with the way the European Union is defending, is taking a position on the Ukraine war. So I expect a big discussion of those values during the election. And I do think that press freedom is, as we said, a canary in the mine shaft, meaning that if you protect press freedom, you can be sure that you will protect human rights and democracy and rule of law. So this is a key moment to assert those values during the elections.
One of the recommendations that I found particularly interesting in the report is the recommendation to change the way the general regime of conditionality works. So at the moment, the EU can move to suspend EU funds for a member state when rule of law violations pose a risk for the financial interests of the bloc, but this recommendation is to add media freedom as a criteria. So I was curious about the reasoning behind this.
I mean, we see this as enormous leverage, and you know, we would encourage the Commission to think innovatively. It's done so already. It's done so with when in Hungary, when independent radio station Klub Radio was suspended, it started infringement procedures by getting its lawyers to look at telecommunications law. So it did it then, you know, and, you know, it also did it with the European Media Freedom Act by looking at, you know, what internal market law could allow it to do in order to make the proposal. You know, I think that there's a very interesting, I mean, again, I think we need to be realistic about what we can ask, but I do think that there's a very interesting intersection here around, as you mentioned, values as they then impact on the budget. Well, there's a very interesting intersection here with journalists who cover corruption and financial crime. And we have numerous journalists, you know, in countries like Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary, who are looking at this question of EU funds, and also journalists who are looking at the question of EU funds, but then, you know, because of that, experience harassment. And I think, you know, it really is for the Commission now to think innovatively around that and then to use that as a platform. Obviously, you know, the conditionality debate then goes much further. You know, I think that this is a sort of common mantra amongst a lot of civil society groups that, you know, this for us is the money is the leverage. The money is the leverage. And as Jean-Paul said, like, you know, we need to defend the rule of law, because the rule of law and press freedom will also, in the way that journalists are doing so in all these EU member states, it will actually protect EU interests. It protects EU values, and it protects EU financial interests.
We just add the slogan of investigative journalists, follow the money, applies to the rule of law mechanism.
As a reminder to those following online, you can put your questions in the chat. But first, I was wondering if you have any questions in the room. Yes, sir. Yeah, we got a mic. If you could introduce yourself.
Yes. Nawab Khan, I'm the Brussels correspondent of the Kuwait News Agency here in Brussels. And I haven't seen the report as yet, but I would like to ask you on the situation in Ukraine and press freedom. Here, a lot of Russian media has been banned because of spreading disinformation. Now, I would like to ask you, how is this move or how this position is going to affect the press freedom globally? Because as you said, mentioned that the rest of the world looks upon the EU, as a guide for press freedom. Because other countries also can use this excuse to put a gag on their own media. So your comments on this, please. Thank you.
We note this in the report, and this is a concern for press freedom advocates. Around the ban of Russian media, we're currently in a conversation with the Commission, and have been for some months now, about the ban. Now, in the concerns that we've expressed to the Commission, obviously any ban on freedom of expression has to be taken very seriously. And how we framed it is that any exemption around, any ban on freedom of expression has to be an exemption, and you have and not the rule. So it has to be taken incredibly seriously. And obviously, any restriction on freedom of expression has to meet the three-pronged test, whether or not it's legal, whether or not it's proportionate, and whether or not it's necessary. Now, we've raised these concerns with the European Commission. And in particular, we have raised proportionality, whether or not the ban is proportionate. And there are a few aspects that the Commission needs to respond to us on. For example, how they're monitoring the ban, what the impact of the ban is, and obviously what's called a sunset clause, like when does the ban end? The vaguely worded response from the Commission is, when propaganda in Russia ends. So, we just feel that at the moment, the Commission, has to make a better case in terms of the rationale, this three-part test, why it can justify the ban. And it also then ties into something which, we've already discussed around our access to information. We've made requests to the Commission. And as I said, we've actually made a formal freedom of information request back in January, which has been repeatedly delayed. Now we've got a response that one part of the Commission can't help us, but another can, and we can appear. And, we're not getting the information that we need around a question which is of public interest.
Any other questions in the room? We have a follow-up, maybe if, just because the people online can't hear you.
No, I had another question on how this, the press freedom struggle, as you are saying, will affect the media in other parts of the world, Asia, Middle East, Africa.
I mean, I would reiterate a little bit around what Jean-Paul said, that the EU is perceived as a global norm setter. It's perceived as global norm setter. So, with GDPR, with the Digital Services Act, these are bits of legislation which set the norms around the world. Now, obviously, both positive and negative, the EU sets these norms. And so I can't necessarily speak about the media around the world. That's too complicated a question. But what I can reiterate is that as a norm setter, you have a a real responsibility to ensure that the norms that are set out really respect press freedom and really respect sort of standards, human rights standards.
Thank you. You also had a question?
Thanks very much. My name's Oliver Moneycard from the International Press Institute. I was going to ask a much more general question first of all, about the title of the report, Fragile Progress. If I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the fragile progress therefore applies to or refers to the progress at the EU level about giving itself the powers to deal with and intervene to protect media freedom, rather than a general commentary on the level of press freedom in Europe. That was going to be my sort of general question. But I want to sort of, because now I've asked this very, very specific question about the banning of RT and the consequence of that. And I just want to sort of follow up on that. And you have this dialogue with the Commission about proportionality and the legality in the process and stuff. I assume part of the answer to this question is in the Media Freedom Act, I think it's Article 16, which talks about this new board being empowered to deal with third-party media, or rather parties that are based in or originate from third countries, and whether or not when and where they might pose a threat to the security of the EU, and the board therefore would be able to make recommendations on measures to deal with, therefore, disinformation. And I assume that this article arises from the very specific and controversial banning of RT and Sputnik immediately after the invasion. But I also assume that it would therefore apply to, the threat of Chinese disinformation. And just as a sort of a throwaway line, I wonder, therefore, if it might be extended in years to come to organizations such as Fox News or News International, who have been shown to deliberately deceive and disinform and lie. Okay, that might be very specific to the American audience, but that clearly has very global consequences for us. So that's just throwing out sort of 3 or 4 sort of talking points for you to hopefully respond to. Thank you.
I can't really take a position on behalf of CPJ because I'm a journalist who doesn't set the norms of CPJ in this case. It was closer when I was writing the report in 2015 when I was the European representative of CPJ. But for me, I mean, just a few reflections on this. I think that democracies are not supposed to be suicidal. At the same time, their characteristic in relation to authoritarian countries is that they take risk. They take the risk of having inside their own world people, groups that will really contradict completely the principles on which liberal democracy is based. This is what I consider an asset. So I would tend to lean myself always on the side of the risk of freedom of expression than on the reflex of imposing constraints and restraints on the expression of view that we consider even dangerous for our society. I remember during the Second World War, I mean, in the UK, the German broadcast, Nazi broadcast, were not banned. They considered that they were strong enough in the UK to resist any temptation that might come from German propaganda. So this is my view, but I tend to be very much in favor of freedom of expression. I consider that when I said at what point the European Union might cross the line towards censorship when it discusses legitimately and very often with good intentions the impact of disinformation, and not just Russian disinformation, but also private disinformation, groups disinformation, Chinese disinformation, but also many countries have policies, strategies of influence. This is something that we have to consider with a lot of attention. I mean, there might be a danger, especially today with with the war in Ukraine and the aggression of Russia, I mean, that there should be no space for any position that might be seen as reinforcing Russia's propaganda. Personally, I think again, democracies are not suicidal, but they are supposed to sustain a lot of contradictory arguments in order to define themselves as democracies. This is my personal view.
I just want to touch on your question around fragile progress. Well, I can touch on a few of your questions. The question around fragile progress, you know, I think considering the time difference from the last report, what we have seen and what we do see is that, you know, there are a continuing there's a continuing building of frameworks and structures in place, both within, you know, the External Action Service, in terms of what the Commission has been doing on press freedom reforms, and you know that we do see that in terms of the way that the institutions have generally responded over the last years to press freedom and making it a priority. This is progress in itself. But then all the other different aspects, the threats, the problematic legislation, the question of access to information and trade secrets, GDPR, etc., and also foreign policy, this then makes that progress a bit more fragile. So it sort of cracks it. So, you know, with the report, we really have tried to bring all of this together, and it actually could really be quite useful for, we hope, people really looking into the question of media freedom in Europe, because there are lots of different angles that could be explored for researchers. Just going back to a little bit around this question, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, this question around disinformation, I do think that there's also this move that we've seen, as you mentioned, I think with the Committee on Foreign Interference within the European Parliament, and also the Strategic Compass, which is a sort of EU's defence and security plan until 2030. You know, both have made calls for strengthening media pluralism and independence as a means of countering disinformation. And I think that this is really important with all of this, that we focus on, you know, going back to the very start of our presentations, the conditions that journalists are also working in. And actually, like, you know, what we can be doing as press freedom advocates is also, you know, making that message very clear. And very lastly, with the board, yeah, I mean, I think that you know, the big question that we all have is, how is this board actually going to work? But I would say that, again, on sort of defining like the criteria around you know, questions on disinformation and so on, we would want to have, through this structured dialogue, you know, really good engagement, and not only just good engagement, consultation, you know, and sort of meaningful engagement, where we can see that, you know, what we value as press freedom advocates is then being turned into, you know, written opinions and so on, that actually then translate into sort of real impact on the ground. We're certainly not there yet with the European Media Freedom Act.
Any more questions? Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add something concerning the fragile progress. Just comparing what I saw 8 years ago and what I've seen co-writing this report with Tom. I mean, is that when I talked to people in 2015, I mean, I had the feeling that there was a hodgepodge of policies and statements, confusing, good intentions, but no structured strategy. I think what's really interesting in that case today with the current Commission since 2019, and there is a plan, and a plan means a commitment to really have a comprehensive strategy to defend press freedom within the constraints of the EU institutional and constitutional context, which is of course the real issue, because there's the EU is the EU. I mean, and there are limits to what the best intentioned people can do because of how the EU has been conceived as a strange animal atop member states. But I do think that really there was progress because there was precisely this strategy. And I hope, and we have been discussing it, we hope that there will be in the next phase after the elections and the new commission, that the strategy will be strengthened, will be continued, strengthened, but also that they will find new ways to grab other prerogatives, other powers for this kind of commitment to press freedom.
Any more questions in the room? Yes, the gentleman in the back. If you could introduce yourself.
Of course. Yeah, good morning. I'm Álvaro from Frontline Defenders. Journalists are often human rights defenders, so this report is very important for us. So thank you for that. I was wondering, what role do you think, if any, that the Council of Europe and the OSCE representative on freedom of the media should play in protecting journalists within the European Union? And how effective is the mechanism to protect journalists within the Council of Europe? Thank you.
CPJ, like IPI, is a member of the Council of Europe Journalist Safety Platform. This is a very effective, a unique accountability tool that allows press freedom organizations and professional associations to post alerts, which is basically research on a platform which is coordinated through the Council of Europe and then requires the respective government to respond. And this is a unique accountability tool. What we want more of through the platform is actually we don't have enough responses from member states. We want more responses, and we also want better quality of responses. You know, we need to see in those responses that there's been tangible measures taken by the government to remedy the complaint, but also to improve the conditions that journalists work in. The Council of Europe Committee for Media and Information Society is also developing a 5-year campaign around journalists' national safety action plans. This is going to be a very important bit of work. It's going to really allow us to structure our engagement within Council of Europe member states and to have this discussion around what needs to take place nationally. With the OSCE media representative, this role is particularly important because the OSCE media representative has, when the representative speaks out, it really supports us as a press freedom community, it supports national civil society, it generates awareness. And so really, you know, we look for that continued speaking out, that continued pressure on governments of the OSCE. You know, those missions that the representative does, as I said, provide real support for journalists on the ground. So we'd like to see more of that. There's been good, better, improved communication, I would say, over the last few years, both between the Council of Europe and the European Commission. And we know that there's also communication with the OSCE media representative as well. So, you know, there really is engagement. The more coordination and engagement, we would say, the better. Because obviously the Council of Europe and the European Commission are now sharing various objectives around what needs to happen in terms of strengthening media freedom and pluralism. So the more that there's coordination and the more that we as press freedom groups can engage in that coordination, the more effective we, or the better our chances of actually really pushing for change on the ground.
Jean-Paul, did you have anything to add on that? We do have one question that came in online. What can be done at national level and which initiatives exist that can have an example function? I can repeat the question. Yes, what can be done at national level and which initiatives exist that can have an example function? So I suppose if there are any national initiatives that you think could also work on an EU level or that you see as sort of a good example.
I mean, national safety action plans is a very simple answer that then would provide a number of different detailed action points for, you know, strengthening and training law enforcement to better investigate and respond to threats against journalists. We also have, the question of outreach to journalists and making sure that journalists know that independent tools that they can trust or mechanisms exist that they can report to. This is very important. Let me just touch on some, because I'd like to get to the online harassment, because that's very important because it ties into the DSA and the EU. But, in terms of physical safety, we do have some good examples in the Netherlands and Sweden. There are action plans. Fairly recently, I was on a Council of Europe Journalist Safety Platform mission to the Netherlands, where we looked at an independent protection body, Perseverance, which has been set up so that journalists can report threats. And it also then provides sort of a sort of independent platform for interaction with the police and the authorities. And, I think that there are lots of hidden lessons learned from putting in place these measures. Firstly, these measures, they take time. You can't just set something up and it works. These measures have to be not just a long, they have to be a permanent commitment. Until journalists stop being harassed, protection, safety action plans have to be put in place and they have to be permanent. Again, I think there is some certain interesting aspects of these action plans that was also noted in Sweden that, when governments actually decide to make journalist safety an issue, and government officials then, issue, instructions or guidance or whatever to law enforcement officials, this really has a trickle-down effect. Firstly, the officials in place then start to learn about, well, what are the threats that journalists are under? And then, these often very sort of localized police officers will then actually have to themselves learn about, what are the threats and how do I respond to them? So there's a very interesting aspect there of judicial and police reform and, getting that sort of political messaging at national level to then trickle down and the sort of behavioral or social effects that you see. But again, this question of online harassment is very key. Safety is something which also, involves all of us. Journalists can also make themselves safer. But, I think just in terms of bringing this back to the EU advocacy, rather than focusing on journalist risk assessments, for example, with the Digital Services Act, we do have this question of sort of online harassment and takedowns. And, I think that the platforms do now have a responsibility to show that they're handling journalist complaints effectively. We also have, through the DSA, the risk assessments, which should provide for mitigation measures. These need to build in the sort of press freedom component. So again, I think, this continued pressure on the platforms is going to be very important. But again, from this recent mission to the Netherlands, from what we were told, Twitter weren't being responsive to the fact that, you do have this barrage of just online abuse against journalists, and this is a daily occurrence. So, those are a couple of things. I've touched on a couple of aspects, but I'm really going to have to stop there. But again, national safety action plans looking at legal, digital and physical threats would be a quick answer.
Thank you so much. So unless we have any further questions in the room or online, I think we'll wrap it up for the day. As a reminder, for those in the room, we have physical copies of the report here. For those online, you can find the report on the CPJ website. Thank you so much to Jean-Paul and to Tom for sharing their thoughts about the report that they co-wrote. Thank you for the audience who followed us online and for those in the room. And if you have any questions, you can contact CPJ to discuss further. Thank you so much.